you. This is a music video that the current project I'm in has just recently done. Actually, not too recently. This is about 6-7 years old now. And as you can see, the production value is quite high. The entire crew was sourced in Beijing, and the locations were made in Beijing. The music is produced in China for the most part. It's actually also in conjunction with a producer in Italy as well called Rodion. And this was shot, I think, about 7 years ago. And as you can see, it looks a little bit like the Swiss Alps, a little bit less like Beijing than the Swiss Alps. I'm just going to turn that down. And I wanted to start this with an introduction with what I'm doing. About, I would say roughly, if I count the math, 15 years ago, I moved to Beijing from Los Angeles because of a job offer from MTV. MTV offered me a chance to go and become part of their TV program and to host my own show because they needed a bilingual host with some experience in media, and I seemed to fit the bill. And I did a series of kind of trials with them, and eventually I realized MTV wasn't a fantastic place to work. And I'm just going to cut that off right now. And we're going to play that so we can just go back to my PPT now. And I went through a series of different jobs in China, and all of these jobs had to do primarily with media. And while I was doing these jobs, I also started to do things in the music industry. It was a passion because I liked music, and I was always doing music when I was growing up. And also because I had actually a degree in vocal arts from the University of Southern California, and I had studied the music industry, and I had worked in the music industry also on a pretty low level when I was at the firm. I left the firm to go and join MTV, and from there I worked in all sorts of Chinese media, including China radio station called CRI, China Radio International, and they have another affiliated station called Hit FM. I was always the maverick of these stations, so I was always doing something that the station manager didn't like, and as a result, I was always fighting with the station manager about keeping what I wanted to do exactly the way I want to do it. So I lost pretty much all of these jobs at one point or another and got rehired at one point or another. So I like to compare myself to a much more politically correct Howard Stern, because I think he got fired like 4 times. So CCTV also had me on board as a writer and host, and all of this was happening while I had my own rock band. And this rock band became relatively well known. It was picked up by Warner Music. Ironically, by the A&R director that I used to work for in their promotional department. I used to get freelance jobs to set up different press, like junkets and conferences, etc., for artists like Jean-Michel Jarre. Does anybody know Jean-Michel Jarre? Okay, well, he's a big okay, one person from China actually knows Jean-Michel Jarre. But in the electronic music world, Jean-Michel Jarre is extremely well known, and he's one of those frontier electronic music composers. And he was allowed to perform at places like Tiananmen Square and at like the Imperial Palace, Great Wall, etc. So he was always given these special government favors that allowed him to perform these large-scale shows, and that was my affiliation with Warner in the beginning. From there, I kind of eventually became a Warner artist, and I got to pretty much see how the internal workings of the Chinese music industry worked from both the media side, which is a lot of my background, and also from the label side, from a lot of the mainstream labels and the underground labels. And that was over the years. I had a total of 3 projects, and the first project was Zio. As you can see, it's much more of a pop kind of styling. That's when we were at Warner Music. And Warner was going through a major hit, and it was called the internet. It was called piracy. It was called Napster. And the entire music industry was going through massive shrinkage. In China, there was also another demon, and that was piracy in the form of CDs. In 2000, around the time when Zio was formed, 2004, the CD piracy was starting to overtake the mainstream, like kind of non-pirated versions of printed music, available physical copies. And all of these record labels were going through shrinkage. From early 2000 to around when my band was signed in 2006, they were shrinking year on year. How do I know they shrank? It's because I worked at Warner, and I broke my arm on a broken chair that I could not afford to replace. So as a joke to my boss, I said, you know, one day you're going to have to pay me back for this, because I had a broken arm. And by the way, medical care in China was very cheap. I got that broken arm casted for less than $20 US, would not happen in America. But that was my realization that their company was struggling. Then all of a sudden this money came in from a company called Seagram's. And they make alcoholic beverages. At the time, the Seagram's empire wanted to buy Warner Music, so they bought into Warner Music. And I was thinking, well, this is a good time to sign a label because they're going to have money, they're going to have cash coming in, they're going to be able to afford to push artists. But, when you have a commercial entity buying into the record industry and there's no money to be made, and now internet piracy was starting to also come into play. More and more streaming outlets like Baidu were allowing people to go on torrents and download music. And that's where a lot of young people were getting their musical choices, because frankly, going to a store and buying a physical CD is much harder than going online and waiting a few hours to download a track. It was still slow back then. Unfortunately, it's much faster now. And then, so around 2008, I left Warner. It wasn't a horrible parting of ways. It was more like they didn't have the resources. They were being choked alive by this market, and there wasn't really much they could do. I kind of saw the problems in China with the major music system, so I thought, well, I can do it better with an indie label. So I signed an indie label with Zio, which the indie label had also similar problems, and we left them after 6 months. It was a very short signing because it was done with a friend of mine. So we were able to keep the contracts as a 6 months trial signing. And then we realized indie labels are suffering too. And then we started Pet Conspiracy, which for us was like an electro punk band. It was very on the nose so far as trends were concerned. I remember about a few months after formation, we were getting a photo shoot from Cosmopolitan magazine, and this is actually the result of that photo shoot. It's a little bit, like now it looks very dated, but at the time, believe it or not, it was fashionable. So it was something that was realizing that music and fashion in China at the time had a real tie-in to each other, and it was starting to explode. And fashion was a huge market, so they were able to boost up a lot of artists at the time who were relatively underground, including us. So with affiliations with Cosmo, Bazaar, ID, a bunch of other magazines in China, we were able, actually not ID, I'm sorry, I'm not wrong about that. It was, Bazaar, Cosmo, and Vision. They were able to kind of push us through the ranks. And eventually, that band kind of ended with a personal disagreement, as we generally have, because I had a different business concept and also a development concept about what I thought would work in the Chinese market. So we parted ways, and they tried their concept, and I tried mine. And my concept was tried on Nova Heart, which was formed in 2011. And 2011, Nova Heart for me has been a very successful project because it's not a project that actually came about out of musical passion. I already had those stages. I'm in my mid-30s now, and I'm actually, right now I'm hitting 40 soon, but I was in my mid-30s and I realized I want to do something to see how it all works. How does the music industry work in China? And how is China a litmus test for the rest of the world? Because whatever was hitting the music industry in the rest of the world was hitting China much harder because the regulatory environment had not caught up, but the technology had. And it worked. It worked relatively well as I think it could have worked. I know there's a couple of misspellings in there. Philip just reminded me, unfortunately. I don't have them. But around the world, Nova Heart became our test for what works in media, if we can export something out of China, and we did. We've played Glastonbury since then, Exit Festival, a lot of you non-music people, this is kind of the pinnacle festival so far as cloud is concerned. And we've had a lot of international notice from around the world, including a lot from Germany. We're actually targeting Germany right now. It's one of our best markets. The US, not so much, but we also have some France, the UK. We have a lot of media collaborations in the US, including Fader Magazine, CNN, New York Times, et cetera, but that hasn't necessarily translated to market penetration. And then in Australia, of course, we went on the most important Australia radio station, Triple J, which is called the Star Maker. Basically, whoever goes on this radio station and gets a significant amount of rotation is now established in Australia, at least on indie level, and we were that. And of course, we also had Vogue Italia, etc. But in order to understand this entire journey of why we chose to do this and why we are here today talking about all of this, you have to give you a little bit of a scope of China music industry to begin with. And I can only take it from my perspective. I moved to China in 2002, so we will not start before 2002. We'll start from there on. So early 2000s to 2017. Chinese music industry was, for the most part, dating back to the 1960s, something that was a bit of a stepchild of the Chinese government. They didn't like music very much. They thought the culture was dangerous. If you study Chinese history, you know about the Cultural Revolution. So can I get a show of hands? How many people know what the Cultural Revolution is? Okay, so most people know. Cultural Revolution, basically, the government said culture is bad. Culture is polluting the minds of the young. Culture is selling imperialism and evil capitalist ideas. Culture is tying us down and we have to move forward. Culture itself is a weapon against the minds of the youth. We have to control culture. So they kind of narrowed culture down to a few accepted forms, 10 plays or musicals, that 样板戏, which were allowed to be performed in public, and a few songs that everybody around the whole country sang. But even when it was so narrowed down to these tiny, very, very small group of things that were acceptable in the culture, music was still a very, very deep part of the culture. If you talk about nostalgia, like if you talk to an older generation, and that's why you have the Return the Red songs now, music was a very important part of them. But after Nixon came and the whole entire market of China opened up, and Shenzhen was established as like a free trade zone, which allowed a lot of culture to pour in excess to China, the whole formula started to change. Suddenly, the new generation craved culture, and they craved it deeply. And between the 1980s and in the early 1980s and mid 80s, there was this huge blossoming of culture, and I'm talking about people breakdancing in the street, discos going till 4 or 5 a.m., people dancing. And so there's a real nostalgia for electronic music, especially pop electronic music of the early 80s, because that was flooding in from Hong Kong into Shenzhen and going to all over China. But in reality, Chinese music itself was not very well developed. There were a couple of artists that developed around that time. So that's why when I say I had to give you a bit of background, but we're going to now go to early 2000. By early 2000, all of that had stopped because of June 4th, 1989. And if you don't know what that date is, it's very important, because if you use those numbers in China, you will still probably get earmarked by the Chinese government as being a little bit sensitive, because that was the date of the Tiananmen Square incident, as we call it. The Tiananmen Square incident had a big musical kind of background to it. At the time, an artist called Cui Jian was strumming his guitar and singing in the square with all the students, and the students were singing and singing and singing their versions of songs of revolution. And so it was suddenly like, oh, this culture is back to those days of like Cultural Revolution. All of these people who basically had this idea that culture was dangerous was again having that idea reaffirmed. So in the 90s, there was a massive cultural shrinkage. And that cultural shrinkage first happened very quickly, immediately after '89. And then it continued to kind of be like a low-level buzz. In China, it says it's not the emperor's command, it's the people trying to kiss the buttocks of the emperor that makes it the most difficult for people to operate. And it's true. A lot of people realize that this was the dictates coming from up there. So local self-censorship, local government censorship, a lot of these other censorships, which actually wasn't a direct, immediate directive from the top, became a widespread part of society. And also because the consumption habits of the consumers at that time were basically being geared toward other things. There was still music, and it was more pushed toward pop music, and especially a very kind of state-sanctioned pop music. And that was what was coming out around that time. These are state-sanctioned pop musicians, and they were in the early 2000s still very dominant, and many of them are still dominant to this day. One of them is Han Hong. It's a woman. She's a woman, and she is actually very, I would say, openly masculine, but not openly gay, because that hasn't been, of course everybody knows, but it's like basically an open secret. You have Sun Nan, who sang songs that were very patriotic, and also songs that were very much about love, but very, all of these artists are kind of coming up through this one particular show called the CCTV Gala. CCTV was the dominant state-owned media, and they had a big year-end gala, which all of the big artists would come and stand on the stage, and it would go to every household, and everybody watched this around New Year's. So whatever artist they put on that stage would become like the next artist. And then it was a state apparatus that owned culture. It was a state apparatus that moved pop culture. But that state apparatus wasn't enough. Young people wanted more. And there was always, and in China, you'll start to see that there's this conflict, there's war, and this dance, and this collaboration between private and public. And private and public are constantly both at war and both symbiotic with each other. On the public side, this thing called Mandopop started coming up around early 2000. And these were artists that sang in, not in Cantonese, but in Mandarin. So they were much more approachable for a lot of young audiences around the world. They were highly influenced by American pop music. And they were extremely slickly packaged. And they all came from Taiwan. And the Taiwanese pop system went into China full force in early 2000. In fact, they were dominant. And because you can see, just as a comparison, one-to-one, as a young kid, are you more into this? Or are you more into this, right? Are you more into this, or are you into that dude, right? So there was an obvious aesthetic comparison, a packaging comparison. I mean, Jolene was like the Britney Spears, Yu Jay Chow was like your Justin Timberlake, and SHE was like, you know, I don't know, some whatever. There's so many that SHE could be, like Spice Girls or something. And then you have all of these other artists on the bottom that just frankly weren't matching up to what the youth market wanted, and they exploded in the commercial way into China. And commercial consumption, not like state-owned public consumption of culture, was becoming more relevant because now we're about a generation removed from Tiananmen. There's not very many reasons to continue with this paranoia. A lot of these kids grew up with no knowledge of anything that happened before there was China opening up to the world. And they wanted to have stuff that was poppy, that was candy, that was more current, more fashionable, more new. Meanwhile, in early 2000, because a lot of these rock outlets, rock music, by the way, was part of the mainstream in the 90s, by then they had already died out. And a new underground movement started. And this underground movement started around the mid-90s and was continuing to be much stronger in, like I said, these are the bands that started Miserable Faith, PK14, Secondhand Roses started before the 90s, and now they're basically festival main acts now. And they can bring in 30, 40, 50,000 in audience very easily. These were the early generation rock acts. The second generation started in 2003, and they came out of universities primarily. They were coming out of Beida and Tsinghua University. Zio not, because they came out of my band. That was my band before we were transformed by Warner Music into a pop act. Anyway, Hedgehog came out of Communications University. Carsick Cars was coming out of Beida and Tsinghua. And all of these university bands were well-educated, very into Western culture, could speak English, and frankly, they liked rock and roll. And they were listening to what was going on in the West because it was available now, either through other university students bringing in physically or as a torrent that you can download online. So their influences were Joy Division. Their influences were Sonic Youth. Their influences were Western bands that did similar things. Their influences were very much about what was happening in the United States and what was cool, hipster kind of culture there. So this is Hedgehog. This is, I think, released in 2002 or 2003. So as a result, the rock scene had a couple of, I would say, patrons that started to arise. One of them was a bar called D22, happened in Wudao-ko, and another one was Mao Live House, a bar that was actually opened by a Japanese company in collaboration with another Chinese person in Beijing. And Beijing was the heart of the world. Like all the bands, a lot of them weren't even from Beijing. They moved to Beijing to be part of this rock scene. And there was also a school called the MIDI School of Music that literally taught modern music. A lot of metal. Like actually we're really into metal music, and anything with the guitars where your hands have to go like this. Actually it's the right hand, goes like this. So MIDI School of Music was teaching modern music to that group, and a lot of these bands in the top, like Miserable Faith and stuff, they're all like old MIDI graduates as well. They're like first generation, mid-90s, they graduated from MIDI School of Music. They started making music around the late 90s. But this scene kind of existed completely independent of everything that was going on in the mainstream. They had maybe like, they played out of bars that sometimes had like, I would say, less savory business as their main business. One of them was called the Get Lucky Bar, and guess what? You can pay to get lucky. But there was also a punk rock scene inside of the Get Lucky Bar. So if you go to the right, you get lucky. On the left, you probably end up in a mosh pit with a bunch of smelly punk rockers. So you kind of have to make sure that you go in through the right door. And the pop scene was just getting progressively more candy, more younger. And then something happened. In the mid-2000s, China kind of woke up and said, you know what, the kids are probably not going to continue to listen to Han Hong and the guys, the Black Ducks. It's not really their thing. We have to have something of a domestic pop industry, or else Taiwan's going to completely take over. And there were a couple of stations, private stations, that saw opportunity. One of them was Hunan, Hunan Station. And Hunan Station said, we're going to make the next pop star. I'm going to do it like the Taiwanese do it through a TV show contest, or the Americans do it through a TV show contest. So they cut up some different formulas of various TV show contests that they borrowed from Taiwan and the US, and they created the first star maker system via TV show contest in China. And these are the results. I mean, they're, I would say, still two of the largest pop stars in China. One of them, both women, by the way. Li Yuchun, who had this image of being a tomboy, kind of like, and in China, tomboy culture is very, very popular. Like looking like a guy as a woman is a benefit, not a detriment to your career, for sure. And Jane Zhang, on the opposite of that, she was much a girly girl, kind of, and the two of them came from that Hunan system. So did the Superboys, also a Hunan station thing about making this TV show contest. And Zhang Jie came from that. I think it was one of the first bigger artists that emerged from that, from the 快乐男生 era. So those artists kind of came out, and they weren't very good singers, most of them. They were actually selling on personality, much like the Taiwanese artists were not very good singers. None of the Taiwanese artists were like, you know, you wouldn't put them up against Beyonce. But they were cute and they were adorable, and they had like this kind of like, you know, I could be your girlfriend or your boyfriend or your best friend or your sister or your brother. But there was always some archetype of something that fit into your lifestyle in Chinese culture. It's like somebody that was missing, something that had a bit of glow, but at the same time was still part of, like, just about as talented as you were, frankly, but much better looking. And then Zhang Jie and the Supergirls, they were the same. Jane a little bit more on the talented side, and she kind of had a longer career as like being the artist that was much more skill-oriented compared to the other artists, which were more personality-oriented. But based on that Taiwan formula, pop music became big in China for the first time again, and it started pushing these Taiwanese artists to the side with a domestic pop industry. Meanwhile, the rock industry, in their complete little bubble of self, decided to create their own world. And this was completely entrepreneurial, self-generated, not very much funding coming from anyone, and definitely no help from the government. D22 in Wudao-kou, Mao Live House in also all of these venues, by the way, are in Beijing, and Yugong Yishan, which I wanted to wear their 13-year anniversary t-shirt today, but I decided not to. And these venues became epicenters where new scenes started growing. D22 was basically New York in 1960, like late 1960s, early to early 80s. You know, it was like almost like, it looked like CBGBs, and it was like CBGBs. And the influence was whatever was rolling through CBGBs at that time. There was also a fair amount of krautrock influence in there as well, but that was the influence of D22. Mao Live House, a bit more Japanese, a little bit more, so with Japanese rock, it's more skill-based, it's a little bit more pop. There was also a bit more like Britpop in there, kind of inserted in there, because Britpop was definitely not welcome as CBGBs. And there, Yugong was kind of like the larger scale venue where all of these different artists, including the older generation artists and new generation artists, could congregate. Yugong had different personas, but by the time it was the mid-90s, they were up to a capacity of 700 people and filling it pretty regularly. And meanwhile, large-scale music festivals happened. All this while electronic music in China was not doing nearly as well. In the mid-90s, there started a rave scene. And I don't have a lot of pictures for that, unfortunately. A rave scene that happened in Beijing and Shanghai and other cities, but in Beijing, it was mostly centralized around these great wall raves. So, it wasn't really good for any historical buildings or whatnot, but they would just basically have a bunch of cars, and Tom was there, have a bunch of cars show up in Wudao, pick up the students, a lot of them foreign students, and put them in the cars and drive them out to the wall where somebody in one section of the wall had set up a sound system and a bunch of DJs were there, and then they would go and just do a rave on the wall for about 2 days. These things got progressively bigger. Even Quentin Tarantino ended up at this during the shoot for like the Kill Bill. And eventually these wall raves got a little bit out of control. Because they were getting just frankly too big for the completely chaotic and non-official organizational system. And that kind of, as all things, ballooned up to when somebody actually died. And when you have death, then you have regulation. A lot of times that's what happens. In China, death equals regulation. So around the, I would say, beginning of 2000s, when all of this in the rock scene was going on, the wall raves were getting shut down. The clubs were getting shut down because one illegal club burned down with a lot of people inside. It had a huge club in the basement space with one exit. And then something caught on fire, and not surprisingly, almost nobody could get out. So that happened in Guangzhou, and that also killed the club scene. So electronic music was actually taking a hit around early 2000 when the rock scene was kind of revitalizing itself. And it was full of kids that wanted to participate all of a sudden, because suddenly they had places to play, they had reasons to play, and they had social clout from playing. And when the festival scene started, this is MIDI Festival, a smaller picture of it, and I'll show you another video which Helen Fang showed about MIDI Festival just a few minutes from now. MIDI Festival was also like a chance where, we're gonna have an outdoor rock festival. It was the first time anybody had thought this idea, having an outdoor rock festival. And it started with just a couple of hundred people. Now, I would say outdoor festivals are over 100 in China, many of them with attendance of 30, 40, 50, 60,000 people. There are EDM festivals, there are rock festivals. There's nearly a festival every weekend of the year, maybe 2 or 3. On some of the more important holidays, and you have 4 or 5 festivals. There are over 200 cities in China with a population of over 1 million people. So there are a lot of places that have a potential of having quite a large size festival. And that has become a huge economy. So there's MIDI, there's Strawberry, they all started in early 2000. But then like everything in China, we talk about public-private, right? So the public, in the public space, they're kind of going about usually ignoring you or going and doing something wrong for quite some time and not really knowing what's going on the side. And then they notice you. And usually that happens with a shock. And with the shock, it was the 2008 Olympics. Around the 2008 Olympics, they were like, it's the 2008 Olympics. We better get China straight and spiffy for all the Olympic people. So they did that by first shutting down the venues, starting shutting down festivals. They were like, let's go take all of those undesirable elements out of our society that could possibly cause any level of human chaos. And 2008 was a shock. Everybody kind of, I love cats, so I put a lot of cat things in here. Everybody kind of fell off a cliff. The MIDI Festival got canceled, Strawberry Festival got tied down, they weren't allowed to have their international acts in. A lot of these organizers that were starting to break even or make a profit suddenly got hit very, very hard. Clubs were shut down, events were not allowed to go on, and everybody went through another shock. But shocks in China are common and they usually change into something else. And that's what I said about the public-private relationship. With most music industry has been a study of effects of public policy on the arts. You see, China music industry is a weed. And that's a beautiful thing because it grows despite the structure of the society it's in. It finds opportunity in cracks of the structure. So if there's a crack in the cement, China music industry will grow through it, and it will grow very quickly. In fact, it will create more cracks and more cracks. And the thing about public-private in China, a lot of people don't realize, is that the Chinese government is not that much in control. It's more reactionary than it is progressively policy-oriented. A lot of times it sets an agenda. That agenda doesn't work, never does. And then somebody else in the private sector does something that does work. So the Chinese government has to react to that. And that reaction is where they create a policy or they fund it with more money. So in the last few years, we've seen a giant policy shift, and we'll get to that in a second. So organic growth versus regulated growth. Here comes regulation, boom, 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 regulation steps in. Good regulation versus bad regulation. One of the most weird things about Chinese regulation is because it's a government that doesn't have a lot of, let's say, accountability so far as the kind of policies it chooses to actually start, but there is accountability to the results. One of the policies they had, fielded by this guy called Cui Jian, the one that I told you was singing with the protesters and his music was getting banned and stuff like that, he actually now is in a much more politically powerful position, managed to get the government to ban lip syncing. Does anybody know what lip syncing is?
Milli Vanilli.
Milli Vanilli, there we go. So in China, because of these TV show contests and because of the pop society based on personality and face and the packaging of an artist, the pop industry in China had become one where you have a great personality, you can't sing very well. Or you're already famous and you're quite pretty, but you can't sing very well. Oh well, we don't need you to sing very well. We've got auto-tune, we've got all of these wonderful technological advances that can make the recording process as good for you as possible. And how do you earn your money? Because the recording industry doesn't earn money. You get on stage and you perform it. But how do you perform it without being able to sing it? Well, you lip sync, right? So when he helped the Chinese government basically initiate, and I think he probably painted it all different ways. I can't guess the mechanisms of the negotiations that happened beyond this. It literally knocked 50% of the pop industry off its pedestal. People couldn't perform anymore because they frankly couldn't sing. They never could, you know? And then all of a sudden, you had to tell the audience that you couldn't sing. If you were to, you couldn't deceive them anymore. The only exceptions that they made was for television because of the way that television works. And you know that, I hate to tell you this, but the Smiths lip synced as well during most of their television performances. But the way the television worked is that lip syncing was sometimes a necessity. So they said, okay, we can still lip sync for television, but now we're going to make illegal in China lip syncing. Policy created another crack by which original music and original rock music, indie music, found another place to come out in. And during after 2008, because there was shrinkage and because there was a push against music festivals, which wasn't really about the politics of the music itself, so far as large gatherings of people that they couldn't control. There was also this idea that, well, maybe things are never going to work in China. Look at all of these things that are happening. Let's make an honest effort for the first time to go abroad. There were some trips in the past for people to go abroad, but there was never a policy within labels to target a foreign audience first, and then the domestic audience second. But there was now. And so a few of the road trips that it were included around that time, and this is one of the tours of Hedgehog, and Modern Sky actually put this tour together. It was such a successful tour that all three bands broke up after. No, actually just two. but it was, yeah, well, they at least lost a member or two. There was another band that almost quit the tour halfway through, but they got to experience a little bit of American touring. And I have to say this, Chinese bands are spoiled. They are spoiled because touring in America is not fun. It's being loaded into a van full of your gear, driving cross country to go to a bar where you have to load in your own equipment, load in everything, do your own sound check, and then play to 10 people. And that's a road show. That's what touring in the US is like. And you do that for like 3 weeks straight with like basically no stops and all eating hamburgers and fast food along the way because it's the only thing you can afford, and sneaking 10 people into a hotel room so you can save money on the hotel rooms. So like all of these Chinese bands up to this point, the weird thing about the Chinese music industry is that it was nascent, it was young, but it was also very much a community. that embraced everybody and took care of them. So you go to a venue and there's somebody there with everything already set up for you. And all you have to do is do your sound check, go drinking, have dinner with the guy who runs the venue, and then come and play the show. Doesn't work like that in the US. And so that was when they realized, oh, it's maybe not the best idea either. And meanwhile, in China, another thing that happened when Beijing started getting cracked down. And I'll be honest with you, Beijing did get cracked down. People started, because it's the center of government, it started pushing hard on Beijing, so Beijing clubs, Beijing venues, Beijing festivals started having to find new homes. Before, all of the festivals were located in Beijing. Then they were like, well, maybe let's go a little bit further out of the city. And then local governments were like, oh, you know what, we would love to have this in our own communities because it brings tourism dollars from Beijing kids that want to come to our city because of the festival. It brings a lot of power into, it brings a lot of press that we didn't have to pay for. And most importantly, it's cheap. And another public-private thing. At the time, China had almost a completely public apparatus through CCTV for doing these large-scale events in Tongyishouge. But it was basically very corrupt. The system was very corrupt. It was a way for people in local governments to filter money back into their own pockets through a cash-heavy industry as concerts. So they also banned that. This was also banned through the corruption thing. So all of a sudden, these local governments that used to put all of their budget for large-scale events into this one organization run by CCTV called Tongyishouge, which would give them a nice big kickback at the end of the day, suddenly had this public funding and they didn't know what to do with it. In fact, they couldn't give it to Tongyishouge because it didn't exist anymore. And most importantly, the government was very specific about, you still have to have large-scale events, but you can't have like these megastars that make big, huge checks for coming to your cities anymore. In fact, they capped the amount of money they had to pay for artists. So that allowed, in a way, the rock music industry festival to exist. All of a sudden, these local governments wanted festivals. And where local governments wanted festivals, local clubs also started to grow around these festivals. Because festivals, in a way, a lot of people, you go to these festivals, it's amazing. It's like 60, 70-year-old couple, like sitting there camping while listening to some thrash metal. And, I could play some thrash metal for you, but I'm afraid of everybody's like, and no, like they're sitting there eating picnic on the lawn, listening to thrash metal, going, that's interesting. And, like old ladies taking pictures of themselves with mono, a Japanese, noise rock band in the background. And kids, and tons of kids. All of people being introduced to different forms of music at the same time in a very much like town fair, like state fair atmosphere. And that led to a growth of interest in the independent music, underground music. It was called underground, 地下 at the time. It's definitely not underground anymore. And all of these venues started growing throughout China. So after all of that pain and suffering touring internationally, a lot of bands were like, you know what, let's try and do it more domestic. So the domestic touring route started coming out. And that's also with the train system becoming high-speed rail, and people didn't have to haul their instruments on and off expensive flights anymore, and they can just take a train very easily between cities. That also created a much more mobility for, by the way, most people in China do not own cars, despite what it says in the media. And you don't want to drive long distance on Chinese roads because it's just shipping cars going super fast. You're going to probably get killed. So like for this, suddenly the Chinese bands and Chinese electronic music and Chinese everything started proliferating all over the country. And because of the ban on YouTube, the ban on Facebook, the ban on international information outlets, let's say, China provided, in a way, protection for its own homegrown music industry to actually grow very organically without all of these large forces of people coming in. It was frankly too expensive. It didn't make a lot of sense to bring international artists, and the clearance process made it almost impossible. So domestic artists had like this space, this little bubble which they could operate very easily in, and they did. And this was how it went around the country. Other trends that happened around that time, the TV contests and indie music merged. All of a sudden TV show contests really realized they needed more people, not just pop stars. Pop market was getting a little bit full. And so they started approaching indie artists and saying, would you like to do an indie show contest. So like the people who basically bought the rights for The Voice, they did a couple of episodes of The Voice. Actually, the first round of The Voice tapped a lot of indie talent, either from the jazz world, from the rock world as well, singers that weren't working in the pop world, and they transferred into pop musicians. And also the rise of social media stars turned real stars musicians. Chen Li, I don't know if you guys know, how many people know Chen Li? Almost nobody. Okay, Chen Li is basically a blogger on Weibo who had no musical notoriety, but she was really good at blogging. So she created a blog persona, and occasionally she would do shows, and then more and more people started showing up. And now she's a huge pop star based purely on the fact that she blogs constantly. And a lot of her blogging is about the fact that she's a lesbian, about the fact that she's a vegan, about the fact that she's, well, isn't surprising, a vegan lesbian in China. But about the fact that she also has, like, you know, her thoughts on society, her thoughts on her family, her thoughts on her place in the world. And that blogging actually built up her audience. So when you see her on stage, she interacts with her audience like it's a small bar, you know, maybe a festival stage in front of 10,000 people. But up until this year, when she got some really bad management, which turned her the wrong way, she would like comment between tracks, like, "Oh, what do you guys think of this?" And they used to all call, the audience used to call her "my husband." That was her pet name, "my husband." "My husband, my husband, like sing this song, sing this track." So it was kind of like about the way the society and the youth culture was turning at the time. IP protection kicks in, and we're going to have a couple of graphs for that. And all of a sudden China goes, you know what, we're starting to have a domestic music industry. We're starting to have people who actually pay for this stuff, and we want to have a domestic music industry because manufacturing is not going to work forever. So we need it to be more based on culture, we need more services. So they said, well, the first step to that is IP protection. So there was a huge push in the Chinese market for IP protection, and that IP protection push has basically created a completely new market in China. I would say completely new, because it's like nothing that has ever happened before, based mostly on digital streaming and digital music for a Chinese music market. Up until, I would say, like the early 2000, most of the expected income and growth was to come from live music performance, from festivals, from clubs, from these kind of places. Around about 2-3 years ago, when IP protection started being first talked about quite heavily, and then kind of now this year heavily implemented, now the real growth, everybody expects the real growth to be in recorded music. And that's a big leap. For the first time in, I would say, 20 or 30 years, China has expected growth in the recorded music industry. Also, there became a music industry investment bubble. Now with the IP growth, as all like Chinese investors, they love bubbles. They love to run into a herd of something and jump on it. I think it was virtual reality 2 years ago, and now last year was a big investment bubble on these music industries. And a lot of these investors, they actually came from real estate. So they believed in things called scaling up. Right, and the thing about music industry is that you can't scale up like you can scale up a factory, or you can scale up a building industry. It's not like I buy a piece of land. If I have enough money, then I buy 10 pieces of land. I build 10 buildings in 10 different cities, and I can scale very quickly. You can't do that with bands. The creative industry is not scalable in that way. So when a lot of these investors came in with that expectation of scaling up, they actually hurt the industry more than they helped. And now there's a lot of money floating around the music industry going to the wrong hands, and a lot of losses on the books. A lot of people are in the red when they had been growing organically for probably about 10, 15 years in the black, all because of this investment bubble. On top of that, the rise of a new generation of non-driven Asian-style pop machine-made idols like Luhan and SNH48. So there's a non-TV driven. The reason why I say it's non-TV driven, up until this point, most of the pop stars were made by television. There was some that came out from the social media world, and we have another hip hop artist that we just showed Joseph at the other class, called like Higher Brothers. Right now they have 50 million plays, I think, on YouTube. And then of course Luhan, they came from another machine. And this machine was the Korea pop machine, the K-pop machine. The K-pop machine was very, very strong, and the K-pop machine had been doing well in China for some time. But suddenly, the K-pop machine was seen to see some political backlash, and public and private, right? So privately, K-pop was doing extremely well in the Chinese market. In fact, it was the primary income for Korea cultural industries was coming from China, the primary income. So Gangnam Style, yeah, that was great, but actually they didn't earn that much money from Gangnam Style. Most of the money actually was pumped back into Gangnam Style to make it a phenomenal that it was. It was a money-driven YouTube sensation. It was not at all something that came out naturally. And but K-pop in China was not investing very much, but making tons of money because there was lots of sponsors that had to do it, and the kids were buying it up. But then suddenly, one day, unofficially but still officially, all the big promoters were said, don't book Korean artists, period. And that was their income. Live performance was their primary income. Don't book Korean artists, period, because of a political situation that had nothing to do with the music industry. And a lot of times that's the public and private. And suddenly the K-pop people died, but you had here Luhan, he's basically a Korean artist except he's Chinese. So a lot of these machines realize, you know what, let's just make Chinese artists like the Korean artists. We have to schedule them for the appropriate amount of dance lessons and plastic surgery, and everything is kosher, right? So they started creating these Chinese stars out of the Korean system. And they first were put in a boy band, then they were taken out individually, they were given the appropriate dance training, they were stuck back into the market. And of course, the revival of the recorded music industry, the franchising of festivals. Now we had Modern Sky Festival with over a dozen festivals across the country. MIDI Festival was franchised to 4 or 5 different festivals around the country. At their peak, I would say it's already past their peak. We had sometimes festivals that had over 20 or 30 festivals going a year at different locations throughout the country. So I'm going to go back to this is actually the wrong pitch, one. Sorry, I'm going to go to this one. I was wondering why it was a little bit awkward. There we go. And there was also 2 major trends that came. One is hip-hop. Hip-hop exploded this year in China, massive scale. And we're going to get to Chinese electronic music. Sorry, you guys, we took a bit of a diversion. Hip-hop became so big because, one, and my partner always told me it was going to happen. I said, no, it's not going to happen. Hip-hop is too political. There's no way. But my partner said, but it's also very candy if it wants to be. So basically, a candier, much more youth-oriented version of hip-hop has now taken over China. It's not really politically oriented in any way. It's definitely not like an NWA thing, like F the police. It's more like, this is my life, and this is what I'm going through, and this is my world on social media. And it utilizes a lot of social media means to create kind of a new image for themselves, and they're also very international. They're a lot of times more, and another thing that helped hip-hop kind of break that. Now, all this was kind of bubbling already itself on social media. And then one particular TV show, which means, I think in 中国有嘻哈, which I think means China has rap music, and I think a lot of Chinese people were like, yeah, I know that one. Another kind of TV show, but it's more like the format is really more for online. Most people are watching it actually not in television format, but for online format. I think it's essentially an online show that gets some syndication on television. That show became super huge with the same formula as Show Me the Money from Korea. So the influence of Korean television, of Korean packaging on China in the last 3 years has really exploded into a lot of domestically made products that are very, very commercial. I wouldn't say they're artistically strong, but that have a lot of Korean, the way that Korea knows how the music industry works. And meanwhile, we're gonna go back to the electronic music industry now. In the mid-1990s, there was this explosion of rave culture. And that was much more of an underground tone. It wasn't commercial at all. And then in early 2000, that of course was dying. Took a big hit from the club burning down, from like the person swan diving off the Great Wall during one of these Great Wall raves, from drug enforcement in China going progressively higher and higher. And of course the club scene is very much tied in with also drug culture at the time in China. Then something happened around like about mid-2000, late mid-2000. Different collectives started to create kind of these parties around different scenes. At that time, China club culture, primary China club culture, was remixes of Chinese pop songs at 150 BPMs, going as loud and fast as you can to a bunch of people playing dice and doing drinking games. It was not dance culture in any way. It was drinking culture with a lot of loud electronic sounds and pop music mixed together very loudly in the back. Extremely outrageous clubs that had absolutely no dance floor. In fact, if they did have one, it would be the size of my podium. And that culture was, it was relevant, but it was also part of the debaucherous, like, me throwing my bling around. I want to show you my money. I want to show you how much money I can afford. A bottle of alcohol at these clubs ran sometimes as extravagantly as $1,000. Yeah. And you would go and sit down at a table that you pay another $1,000 for and buy $1,000 US of alcohol, just one bottle with a bunch of mixers. It comes with mixers, I hope, for that price. And then, and it also comes with certain girls. And then you would sit there with your buddies drinking and playing drinking games at your table where you can really not hear anything because the sound is turned up so loud that you walk out of these clubs with your ears bleeding. And that was like club culture in China all the way up until mid-2000s. But then these kind of party collectives started again. They wanted to do stuff, maybe sometimes at these clubs or off locations or different spaces, acupuncture, yen. They started creating it first for more of an expat student population, but that expanded gradually into the Chinese. The first techno club opened, really devoted to more techno and underground electronic music in Beijing. There were some before, but this one was definitely a dedicated club. It was called White Rabbit, run by a Swiss guy called Thomas Gestadt, who's since then, because of age and certain things with his liver, he has switched to making fantastic sausages. So if you do want to go to a sausage restaurant in Beijing, that used to be the beginning of techno club. It's really good and it's called Stuffed. So Thomas Gestadt and a couple of other characters, Beijing DJs, started this club called White Rabbit, including Yang Bing, etc. And they had this club and there were Chinese people who started coming in as well, and a lot of that first generation of DJs kind of came out of that club or that particular clique. And from there, those DJs went and said, you know what, we need to have minimal techno. Sometimes you just need minimal techno. And very, very connected to German-influenced music, not so far as Detroit. We just actually talked a little bit about this. A lot of these people had also gone to Germany or had studied in Germany or lived in Germany for a period of time. They started kind of more the party scene, revitalized the party scene in China. And eventually that party scene turned into several clubs in Beijing, which became several clubs in Shanghai, which was much more influenced by the UK-based scene. And then eventually this happened. EDM came to China. Electronic dance music, so far as
known elements comprise our universe.
So this is commercial electronic music. This is the intro to the festival, and as you can see, it needs to be big.
Allow us to experience the beauty of the world around us. If the motion from a single insect,
and I'm gonna just.
a ripple effect.
Okay, all of this like extremely unnecessary.
Recently, our world has
I'm just gonna skip it. Like it's progressively building, becoming more galactic. And EDM exploded into China, and it fit into that in-between zone of that loud club with a bunch of people playing dice, surrounded by girls at $1,000, and that underground club world of a bunch of people in a dark room with no lighting, dancing to techno. And this is what we got. Heavily sponsored by Budweiser, by the way. Love the Pokemon reference. This is the way Jane, the pop star, she started making EDM music now. So EDM festivals have also exploded out of China. This was an in-between world built a little bit on the backs of the festival culture that had already been established in China. Rock music established festival culture in general. People were comfortable and used to going to festivals, and they were comfortable and used to going to really crappy clubs with the dice and the bad loud music and the expensive drinks and stuff. So EDM kind of fits somehow naturally into that in-between zone. And all the people who used to go to music festivals went to EDM festivals. All the people who used to go to these kind of like, you know, expensive clubs started going to EDM festivals. It was somehow the marriage of the two. And people who started watching music, pop music, they went to EDM festivals because the organizers are very smart. From the first festival on, they said, okay, I'm going to get a pop star, a well-known Chinese pop star. And I'm gonna get this pop star to collaborate with a well-known Western EDM producer. And we're gonna get them together and they're going to make a track, and that's gonna be our excuse to put Chinese pop music, which was very sugary sweet at the time, very not mainstream at the time, onto the EDM stage. Okay. This is not my favorite style of music, so we're going to try and keep that short as possible. But as you can see, it's a commercial success. And now a lot of Western brands like Ultra, which is one of the largest EDM festivals in the world, as a brand, they started out in Miami, is coming into China. Their pre-sale tickets sold out within a few minutes. And that was kind of almost like an event in itself. There was one viral video online of a kid who had bought 7 cell phones. And by the way, this EDM festival, their ticketing is not cheap. We're talking about $200 to $300 US for the basic ticket for one of these shows. And you know, for the VVIP tickets, you know, like you could basically get like a VVIP table with your drinks and dice still, like the clubs, except now you have a VVIP space. That can run as much as $2,000 or $3,000 US for a ticket. So it's that kid on this viral video had bought 7 cell phones, smartphones, and had signed up to 7 different accounts to try and grab pre-sale tickets for Ultra. So he had his hand over these phones, and it was a countdown clock for when pre-sales were available. And as soon as they were available, he was like with his phone, right? All of them, and he's like, "Yes, I got tickets!" And that is about how like this new generation of promoters are using social media and the viral appeal of social media. Meanwhile, like EDM festivals have grown exponentially. Rock festivals are still growing, even though it's a little bit older. And audiences are starting to seriously segment. The segmentation happened, like for instance, I think we showed a couple of videos of Shao in the clubs. So for instance, this is a club in Shanghai called Arkheim. Shao Arkheim. This is a normal electronic club that doesn't do EDM. And this is an artist that's going to be playing tomorrow, so I thought he's wandering around right now. Stuff that's actually much more artistic oriented, much more interesting, and there is a huge subgenre of this. About this year, I think, is the first year Shao is going to be performing actually at Storm. We're a little bit in shock ourselves. We're like, but why? Because he's not like trying to pump up 1,000 people with like, you know, giant teddy bears. He's much more of an intellectual, much more on the side of experimental techno. And the reason for that is because these EDM festivals, just like the rock festivals of early days, they're starting to segment as well. Storm probably at one point or another realized, oh, you know what, there's a huge audience for techno that isn't coming to our festivals, and they dance and they like electronic music. And so now we're going to start separating another dance area, which is now devoted to techno, separate another dance area, which is devoted to house music. And we're going to have those different dance areas kind of be the new part of our culture. Also, there's other festivals that are not EDM festivals. One is Intro Festival. And I can see if I can find the Beijing Intro Festival. Like other festivals, like this is a festival that was started originally by the Acupuncture Crew, Subliminal Techno Collective, that started around early 2000. They started having, that's Wang Di, he's Acupuncture Records. And this was an old factory space. I think this was the last year that they were allowed to do it, was 2010. And the reason was people were going a little bit nuts. And this is government land. So at one point or another, when they were trying to get somebody extremely high off of one of these like factory pipes, they realized that maybe they weren't allowed to do it anymore. So this is much more like what you would see in Europe, in Berlin, and the spirit is much more Berlin. And it's not EDM. It's not like a big commercial thing. It's much more kind of minimal techno, minimal techno, and minimal techno. That's Peggy. I actually know half the people in this video. Yeah, by 2015, that's when Storm, actually it was not necessarily China's largest electronic festival. People get a bit exaggerating with their descriptions sometimes. I think by 2015, the Storm started in 2014, right? Yeah, 2014. Storm had already come in and was already the largest by then. But you can see the contrast of the market. Now, generally, China is segmenting into Michael Fang. He's one of the Cheese Beat guys, the original Great Wall Rave guys. Michael, the whole entire electronic music scene is now segmenting. You have the mainstream electronic EDM music, which you saw with Storm, and it's grabbing a lot of audiences from the pop world, from the rock world as well, people who want to basically go rage. And then you have like this organic growth electronic music scene that is kind of like the children of the original raves on the Great Wall. A lot of the DJs that were here playing at this festival were the DJs that played on the Great Wall in the mid-90s, in the early 2000s. And they're the organizers now of this entire scene. So far as the club scene is concerned, up until I would just say 2 or 3 years ago, most of China had only commercial clubs. And so far as clubs where you can hear very loud music and play dice. But now that in-between world is starting to happen, in Shenzhen there's a huge club conglomerate that came up, and the Shenzhen club conglomerate is, for instance, they have kind of like more of a mainstream club called Pepper, which does things, A2 Live, this is the afternoon for the Budweiser Storm Festival, so. They do stuff that's what we would call in maybe the club world more mainstream artists, like Fritz Kalkbrenner. If you don't know Fritz Kalkbrenner, he's basically a tech house, you would say tech house, mainstream techno producer. He's quite big. He's like on the borderline of being EDM. And a second ago I said, what is EDM versus what is electronic music? And there's this line that I separate for myself. In my opinion, electronic music is a heritage of everything that came from the 1970s and 80s and on, these electronic producers that produce electronic music for the club scene and for the party scene specifically. There's a heritage of that, and this group of people kind of did it for a smaller group of people. They weren't ever going to make a huge pop star out of this scene. So like you have your Richie Haltons, which pretty much all Berlin. It's hard to like kind of go down the list and list 1,000 DJs. But you have all of these different people who are producing stuff that's specific to one genre and that are doing it primarily for the club scene. And EDM, in my opinion, is pop music. It's electronic music made specifically for a pop audience. It's the Calvin Harrises, the Tiesto maybe kind of crossed over at one point, but it's the Calvin Harrises of the world. It's the Diplos of the world. People that maybe have kind of gone and merged themselves completely with the pop economy. And it's not necessarily part of the underground club economy anymore. And that is EDM. So in my opinion, like right now that in China, both of these different economies, the EDM economy and the electronic music economy, are both very healthy and alive. But the EDM economy is something that has really exploded onto the scene. And there's a phenomenon with Chinese audiences. And that phenomenon is they like things loud and they like things bright, and they sometimes really don't care about what genre it is. They don't even care what style of music it is. As long as it's loud, it's full of people, there's lots of stuff going on, then I'll take it. You know, I'll like it. I'll eat it up until the next trend comes along and I'll move on. And so like these trends move in China very, very quickly. And there's not that necessary knowledge about like particular genres. So like if you go to an EDM festival and people are looking through the thing, it's like, I really want to see this artist. I really want to hear this artist. I really love this track from this artist. A lot of times audiences don't really care. They're just there because they know there's somebody famous that's going to play at like 8 o'clock and that person's really famous and they worked with this Chinese pop star, so they're even more famous now. And it's going to be loud and it's going to be lots of lights and colors and stuff like that. With electronic music, it's very genre specific. So I will not go to, for instance, like techno person will not go to a bass party. Like not gonna happen. I'm not into drum and bass, I'm not into blah, blah, blah. And the drum and bass person is not gonna go to a techno party. It's not gonna happen, you know? And then these individual groups have started creating their own events. Sorry, been talking for a long time. Off of these subgenres. And for the first time, these subgenres started having clubs. And now in Shanghai, for instance, there are probably, right now I can think of 7 or 8 legitimately well-run dance clubs, specific to electronic music, not EDM. And they are very genre-specific. One of them, which came out of Shelter, called All, only wants to do experimental dub. Like very niche stuff. Like they basically want things that are coming out of small labels like Hyperdub in New York. The sound is very much London. It's what's going on in London, in small clubs in London. It's not mainstream at all. Then you have Archive, which is much more commercial, but it's still commercial on the side of like, okay, they'll take hip hop, they'll take drum and bass, they'll take house, they'll take techno. Elevator, which is much more mainstream techno, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's just in Shanghai alone.